welcome. My name is Leslie Howard. I'm the president of the Museum and Historical Society. And my quick announcement is that we have a wonderful raffle going on as a little fundraiser. So you'll see all the baskets in the back there. Tickets are $5 each, or 5 of them for $20. And we have an assortment of great prizes. And the drawing will be May 3rd at our Wild Women of Westford tea, and you don't need to be present to win, but take a peek at them while we're waiting to get started, and I'll be back there if you wanted to purchase some raffle tickets. Thanks.
All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Westford Museum. My name is Linda Green, and I'm the museum director. The Westford Historical Society, in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Westford and the Westford Cultural Council, are proud to bring you Westford Celebrates Women's Right to Vote. Tonight is the second in the series of programs exploring the 19th Amendment and its legacy. I'd like to take this moment to thank our sponsors this evening, Freedom's Way National Heritage Area, Middlesex Savings Bank, League of Women Voters of Westford, the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, Citizens Education Fund, the Westford Cultural Council, and the Westford Historical Society. I'd also like to ask the steering committee for this event to stand up, Deb and Lynn and Donna. Thank you very much for all your support and all you've done to make this event a success. So our program this evening is After Suffrage, a 2020 perspective on women's rights, 1920 to 2020. And follow that will be a panel discussion among a few of our Westford women leaders. Our presenter this evening is Barbara Bernstein. And Barbara is the author of Massachusetts in the Women's Suffrage Movement, a Revolutionary Reformers, Boston in the Civil War, Hub of the Second Revolution, and Walking Tours of Civil War Boston, Hub of Abolitionism. She is also the co-editor in Breaking Barriers, Unfinished Stories of Women Lawyers and Judges in Massachusetts. She is also a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. She retired from her position as senior attorney at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in June of 2019. And she also serves on the board of Boston by Foot and the Royal House and Slave Quarters. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to present Barbara Bernstein.
It's wonderful to be back. I was here just about 2 weeks ago. How many of you were here for that talk about the women's suffrage movement? Oh, great, a good number of you. For those who aren't, I will catch you up to speed very, very quickly. But 2 weeks ago, I spoke on this book that Linda mentioned, which focuses on the women's suffrage movement from the perspective of the national wing that was based here in Massachusetts. And as I began to give many talks about the women's suffrage movement, many places were interested in having me come back and talk about life after suffrage. So I developed this new talk that I've given a number of times. Just like with the suffrage movement, you have to pick and choose what you can cover in a short period of time. Similarly, so much has happened between 1920 to 2020, it's hard to know where to begin. So what I have done is create a talk that's really based on the Equal Rights Amendment, because the Equal Rights Amendment was with us in 1920s, the 1960s and 70s, and is alive again today. And so by talking about the ERA during these three periods, it does allow us to give us at least a little bit of a 2020 perspective on the past 100 years. So I'm going to begin with the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, which of course was ratified in August of 1920, when women gained the right to vote, was very limited. All it did was enfranchise women. It didn't give women in most states other rights. For example, in Massachusetts, women could still not even serve on juries. Women, in fact, were not able to serve on juries in this particular state until 1950, 30 years later. So what did happen after 1920? I mean, many, many different things, but one of the first things that happened was the first debate over the Equal Rights Amendment, a claim that a new amendment should be added to the Constitution stating that equality of rights should not be denied or shall not be denied on account of sex. To begin the story, we're actually going to start with two of our suffrage leaders. Maud Wood Park, who I talked about 2 weeks ago, was the head of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or one of the leaders, by 1920. She was instrumental in passage of the 19th Amendment, and she becomes the first national president of the League of Women Voters, starting in 1920. Alice Paul was head of the more radical National Woman's Party that also was fighting for the right to vote. There was a lot of rivalry between these two organizations because each viewed the other as not helping the suffrage cause during the late 19 teens. Maud Wood Park, her group, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, believed in persuasion, education, lobbying. Alice Paul's group believed in deeds, not words, as they put it, and they were the group that did things like picket in front of the White House. Looking back 100 years later, we know that what both groups did was essential to passage of the 19th Amendment, but that's not how they saw it. They saw each other's as being obstructionist. So there was already a rivalry between these two groups. And the rivalry continued into the 1920s because Alice Paul, who believed that the Constitution should make sure that women and men were treated the same, immediately wanted to introduce, and did introduce, an Equal Rights Amendment into Congress. Maud Wood Park and the League of Women Voters, along with most other women's organizations at that point, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, for example, and others, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment in that era. And the reason was that at that point in time, there was almost no legal protection for workers. Whenever laws were passed that did things like limit the number of hours that men could work and impose any kind of safety or any other restrictions, they were struck down by the United States Supreme Court on the grounds that any such laws interfered with the pure freedom of contract. But there had been some success in passing and upholding protective legislation for women. Famously, in this case, Muller versus Oregon, which was argued by Massachusetts lawyer Louis Brandeis, the court upheld laws that limited the number of hours that women could work in laundries. And so even though Maud Wood Park, the League of Women Voters, and so forth, didn't necessarily like that they were advocating for different treatment between men and women, they thought it was the only practical thing, given the realities of the time, that it was better that women have some protections from dangerous conditions, long hours, and so forth, mindful of the fact that so many women in the working force were also raising children and taking care of homes, versus Alice Paul's approach. Alice Paul's approach, as articulated by one of her top lieutenants, a woman named Doris Stevens, was that protective laws were, in her words, a roadblock to equality, and that women should ask the same rights with which every man is now endowed. And what the League of Women Voters people essentially said to that, well, that's wonderful for women who might do things like work in offices, not so helpful for women who are doing things like working in factories. So the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in the 1920s, but didn't go anywhere. What did happen, however, in the 1920s is that the first big victory of the new woman voters happened, and that is a law called the 1921 Sheppard Towner Act. Its full name was the Promotion of the Welfare and Hygiene of Maternity and Infancy Act. And that was a law that was put forward by, as I mentioned, the League of Women Voters, but also the Women's Trade Union League, the National Consumers League, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and so forth. And the idea was that this law would make available federal money to sponsor state programs focused on the health of pregnant women and their infant offspring. And this law actually passed in 1921, really out of the perceived fear of Congress that if they didn't support it, that they might be punished by new women voters. So this law passed despite the fact that there was, of course, significant opposition. The American Medical Association opposed it, saying that it was a step one towards socialized medicine. The Woman Patriot Corporation opposed it. That was the new name of the anti-suffragists who I spoke about 2 weeks ago, the women that were convinced that suffrage was going to mean the end of life as they knew it. The Catholic Church opposed it. States' rights advocates opposed it. But it passed, as I said, because of concern about being punished. Congressmen and senators were afraid they'd be punished by women voters if they said no. However, It demised, it ended by the end of the 1920s. It was not refunded in 1927 and was allowed to sunset 2 years later. And the reason why that happened is very important, and that's because there were some intervening elections. The elections of 1924, the presidential election, and then the the congressional elections of 1926. And people became aware that there really didn't seem to be any such thing as a woman's vote per se, that women tended to vote based upon the same factors that men tended to vote, based on race, region, religion, particular issues that might have appealed to them based on their occupations or where they lived, and so forth, but not necessarily on gender. So Congress stopped being worried about anything like a woman's vote, and this law disappeared. So the slow start during the 1920s as women entered the political arena. I mean, obviously many other things were going on that if we had hours, I would be able to tell you all about. I'm now going to jump to part two, which is really picking up in the 1960s. As we go from the late 1920s to 1960, of course, a number of different things had happened. First of all, of course, as a result of the Great Depression, we had the New Deal. All those laws that were passed by Franklin Roosevelt and which were ultimately finally upheld by the United States Supreme Court, which brought wage and labor protections to the workforce generally, regardless of gender. So there's progress made on fairness and legal regulation in the workforce. In addition, of course, women entered the workforce in different capacities, most particularly during World War II, when many women entered the workforce, taking and assumed all sorts of jobs. We're then going to get to 1960. As I mentioned, we already had the Fair Labor Standards Act from 1938 with wage and hour regulation. We had more working women by 1960, actually 3 times as many as in 1940. The birth control pill was on the market and available, and that, of course, gave many women far more control over their reproductive life, which, of course, meant far more control over their life. The civil rights movement had begun strongly in the 1950s, and it's typical in American history that women's rights movements, almost always follow on the heels and are stimulated by some other rights movement. 2 weeks ago, for instance, I talked a lot about how the women's rights movement emerged from within the anti-slavery movement. So once again, the women's rights movement is really emerging from within a civil rights movement over race relations. And when John Kennedy was elected president in 1960, a number of activists, many from the labor movement who had supported him, pressured Kennedy to establish in 1960 a new commission on the status of women. One of the women who was very instrumental in pressuring President Kennedy was actually Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of President Franklin Roosevelt. In 1963, that commission issued a report making a claim for a number of different things for women, and very importantly, equal pay for equal work. And on the heels of that, an Equal Pay Act of 1963, the first major legislation to require equality between men and women in the workforce, was passed. Now, it's a very, very important law, but what the Equal Pay Act of 1963 did, as I'm sure some of you know, it was equal pay for the exact same occupations. So it didn't address the disparate wages between men and women when the jobs were defined differently. And that, of course, was a source and still continues to be of a lot of discrimination. Also in 1963, Betty Friedan published her very famous book, The Feminine Mystique, in which she talked about what she called the problem that has no name, or as she put it, the dissatisfaction, the ennui of women who had been well-educated, who were basically told that they should be completely satisfied by having new appliances with which they could bake and cook, taking care of their children, and taking care of their homes. And Betty Friedan, of course, has been criticized for writing about middle class and upper middle class women as opposed to working class women. That is who she wrote for. But she described a problem that was very broadly felt through many people in the population. The following year, in 1964, a major Civil Rights Act was passed. I'm sure you all know it. You might know it by its colloquial name, Title VII. And Title VII is a law that prohibits discrimination by employers who are covered, which is anybody who employs more than 15 employees, on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was established to handle complaints and cases brought under that law, tended to not react to complaints of sex discrimination. They really made their entire focus in the early years racial discrimination. And that led for a number of activist women, including Betty Friedan, who I mentioned, Polly Murray, who had been one of the instigators behind the President's Commission on the Status of Women, and others, to come together in 1966 and form a new organization called the National Organization for Women. And this was actually the first board of directors meeting, as you can see in chairs that look a lot like these, in 1966. And what they said was very forward-thinking in their statement of purpose. They said that we reject the current assumptions that a man must carry the sole burden of supporting himself, his wife, and his family. They also said we reject the assumption that a woman is automatically entitled to lifelong support by a man upon or marriage, or that marriage, home, and family are primarily women's world and responsibility. So that was their statement of purpose, and it was followed up about a year or two later by a Bill of Rights. And in Now's Bill of Rights, they asked for reviving the Equal Rights Amendment from the 1920s that would bar discrimination based on sex from the United States Constitution. You can see they had a broad array of things that they advocated for, including child daycare centers, maternity leave rights and employments and Social Security benefits, and so forth. And very importantly, and the reason in capital letters I said, not individual issues, society, is because women had always been told that whatever their issues were about the jobs, about equal pay, about lack of maternity leave, lack of childcare, and so forth, were their problems to solve. And what Now was saying, no, it's not your problem to solve, it's our problem to solve, it's society's problem to solve. So very, very forward-looking. This is also the time when the younger generation, if you look at this picture again, it's a little hard to tell, but a lot of the founders of Now were not very young. I mean, they were not elderly, but they were in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, and so forth. The younger generation, just like Alice Paul had been over suffrage, was very impatient. And so they were the ones who began protesting and bringing more attention to the cause. And once again, you had the people that were trying to make legislative change being pushed in a way that brought a lot of attention and publicity, which was actually very helpful, by the younger generation who wanted publicity, got a lot of press attention. Things like this Miss America protest in 1968 was covered on newspapers and television stations around the country. Shirley Chisholm, an African-American woman who was elected to Congress in 1968, formally introduced the Equal Rights Amendment in 1969. And when she did so, she said that she was introducing today a proposal that has been before every Congress for the last 40 years, the Equal Rights Amendment. That next summer, in August of 1970, August 26th, because who knows why August 26th? What's significant about that date? Anybody? That's the day the 19th Amendment, the Voting Rights Amendment, was ratified, correct. So 50 years after it, on the 50th birthday of the 19th Amendment, Now, with its allies, organized a women's strike for equality. There were parades and demonstrations all across the country, and they advocated for a broad array of rights, certainly for equal opportunity in employment and education, but also the right to abortion, the right to child care, and given, of course, this was the height of the anti-Vietnam era, opposition to war in the Vietnam, and interracial discrimination, and so forth. Gloria Steinem appears on the scene just about then and begins publishing Ms. Magazine. And some of you may remember the first issue of Ms. Magazine, which had Wonder Woman on the cover. Wonder Woman, who had been an early comic book character, had kind of fallen into absence over the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. and Gloria Steinem revived Wonder Woman with all of her powers to be on the cover of the first issue of Ms. Magazine. Women's rights and a different way of looking at women began to penetrate really into popular culture. And a very telling example of that was the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which may look to us 50 years later as hopelessly old-fashioned, but when it was first on the air, it was quite revolutionary that a woman was living alone in the city, going to work, and not focused on finding a husband. 1972, Congress passed the ERA. The reason it says proposed is the way constitutional amendments technically work is that Congress proposes them to the states, and then the states have to ratify them, and then they become part of the Constitution. So that's what Congress did in 1972 by overwhelming majorities. You can see them, 354 to 23 in the House, 84 to 8 in the Senate. The United States Congress endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment and sent it out to the states for ratification. There was also a lot of discussion then of what we would call today intersectionality, although that word hadn't yet been coined, so that the ERA was also supported by advocates for racial equality and also for gay and lesbian rights. So there was tremendous support for the Equal Rights Amendment for that brief moment in time. But, because there's always a but, no sooner was the Equal Rights Amendment on its way to the states than Phyllis Schlafly, who would become the leader of the anti-Equal Rights Amendment forces, began a new organization called STOP. And STOP stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges, arguing that what the Equal Rights Amendment would do by making women equal to men would take away the privilege that she said that women had always held. And this continues to be, as we will come to get to this at the end, in 2020, an issue that some people feel that women are privileged by not having an Equal Rights Amendment, and many others think that that's insane and that what women need are equal rights. But that debate continues 50 years later. So what Phyllis Schlafly and her allies saw was feminism as an attack on women rather than a defense of women, which was really a whole different way of looking at the argument. They argued that the ERA was an assault on the role of woman as wife and mother, on the family as a basic unit of society. And who were these women? They were, by and large, conservatives, of course, but particularly they were often Catholic and evangelical Protestant women and full-time homemakers. And to think about this debate, I actually drew on some of my favorite suffrage era cartoons. So this is a famous anti-suffrage cartoon published by anti-suffragists. And what it shows here is a very unhappy woman becoming unhappy because she has left behind love, marriage, children, and home. And after suffrage comes strife, anxiety, and loneliness. The idea that if women wanted equal rights, that all these other things would be left behind, that women couldn't have both. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who of course arrives as a leading lawyer on behalf of women's rights by the early 1970s, says that this pedestal that people like Phyllis Schlafly were talking about is really a cage, not a pedestal. And again, I thought back to the suffrage movement, to one of my favorite cartoons by a Massachusetts artist named Blanche Ames. And suffragists had often been portrayed as being radical destroyers of the home. And what Blanche Ames did in a cartoon like this was say, suffrage goes with mother, family, home, and it's this false pedestal of chivalry, which gives you no rights. And the woman on this false pedestal of anti-suffrage has 3 pets, Dodo, Tango, and Fido. So you can see the difference, and that's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg may have been thinking about, or images like this. So the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972 starts off very quickly. In 1972, 22 states quickly ratified it. In 1973, it was followed by 8 more states. So within the first about year and a half, 30 states ratified it. And you may know that the magic number, the number needed, was 38. So off to a very fast start. In this picture, you may recognize the woman in the big hat here. Anybody? Bella Abzug, of course. Another leading woman advocate of the Equal Rights Amendment and a leader in Congress. During 1973, the same year that 8 states were ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, is also the year when the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Roe versus Wade, which upheld a woman's right to obtain an abortion up through the first trimester of pregnancy. And the two issues were joined first by Phyllis Schlafly and her allies. So the same people who wanted to stop the ERA also, by and large, became the same people who wanted to reverse Roe versus Wade and bar abortion. So you had the joining of these two important issues with the same signs, as you can see. Phyllis Schlafly, stop ERA, stop abortion, the same insignia, the same colors, the same everything. Similarly, the pro-ERA forces also joined with that important issue. So they put the ERA together in general with arguments that would rebuke what they called assaults on women's bodies. So they argued for support of reproductive rights, against rape, against domestic violence, against sexual harassment, against pregnancy discrimination. So what had been sort of the ERA only now became the ERA plus on both sides, with all the attendant bitterness that we all know very well. As a result of this, and Phyllis Schlafly's increasing strength and clout, particularly within the Republican Party, ERA ratification slows. And you can see after 22 and then 8 states, it goes to 3 in 1974 and only 1 in each of 1975 and 1977. Making matters even worse, 5 states rescinded the prior ratification that they had given. So the states of Nebraska, Tennessee, Indiana, Kentucky, and South Dakota all rescinded the former approval of the ERA. It remains an open legal issue whether or not a state can rescind an amendment, rescinded approval of an amendment. We can talk about it this time in a moment. 1977, on August 26th, again picking that anniversary, Alice Paul, who had lived for many, many years after 1920 and continued zealously every year to lobby for the Equal Rights Amendment, dies, and there's a very big Alice Paul Memorial March for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1977. There is also a National Women's Conference held in Texas in 1977. And as a result of this momentum, Congress agreed to extend the deadline. So one thing that I didn't mention is that in 1972, when Congress proposed the Equal Rights Amendment to the states, it did something rather unusual. And that is, it was accompanied by a resolution that had put a 7-year timeline for ratification in the amendment. Ratification had to be complete by 1979. And as it was clear that that was not going to happen, its advocates pressured Congress, lobbied in Congress to have the deadline extended. And in 1977, as a result of this march, this conference pressure, and so forth, the ERA deadline was extended to 1982, allowing a ratification. At the same time as that is happening, the anti-ERA forces are protesting actually in Texas that same day across town. So the pro and anti-ERA forces were both out in force. 1980 was a turning point and really arguably the end point of this attempt for the Equal Rights Amendment during the 1970s into the 1980s, because that's when Ronald Reagan, who opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, became the Republican nominee over Gerald Ford, who had supported the Equal Rights Amendment. And in fact, in 1977, this picture over here is Rosalind Carter, Lady Bird Johnson, and Betty Ford all supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. But the Republican Party's support by somebody like Betty Ford shifted, and Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party with Ronald Reagan as the standard bearer, dropped support for the ERA, and in partnership with Jerry Falwell and other members of the conservative and moral majority, said that they must rise up against the tide of permissiveness and moral decay that is crushing in our society from every side. And one of the things they meant by moral decay was women wanting the Equal Rights Amendment. They wanted women to be content to be at home without an Equal Rights Amendment. So that's where matters stand really in 1980. There are no further ratifications despite this 3-year extension. The Equal Rights Amendment has continued to be talked about. It's continued to be entered in Congress most years, but it doesn't go anywhere. Nothing really happens. People continue to focus on it to some degree, but it stops being a lead issue in many women's minds because instead they are working for other legislation, for laws requiring or prohibiting discrimination in pregnancy, for other equal employment laws. And of course, women are carefully watching what's happening in the United States Supreme Court. We are in a series of brilliant cases, many of which were argued, of course, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was working at the Women's Rights Project for the American Civil Liberties Union, established rights for women in the Constitution under the Equal Protection Clause. And in some of those key opinions, one of her allies, or one of the people who supported her point of view and wrote some of these leading opinions for the court, was the first woman Supreme Court Justice, of course, Sandra Day O'Connor. So the Equal Protection Clause, which is part of the 14th Amendment, added to the Constitution after the Civil War in order to remedy racial discrimination, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and others had the brilliant idea, why couldn't it be used to abolish sex discrimination as well? And so over the course of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, a number of cases were brought. And that also made a number of people think maybe an Equal Rights Amendment isn't even really necessary. Maybe relying on the Equal Protection Clause as it's upheld by the United States Supreme Court would be adequate. So things were relatively quiet on the Equal Rights Amendment front for a number of years. Some of the other things that happened during that era, I'm not going to go through the cases, but isn't this a wonderful picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor, much older? Some of the milestones between that era and where we are today, and I'm not going to really stop very much between 2000 and 2016, or even a little bit earlier, but just to remind you, although they're in the very recent past, of course, we have Geraldine Ferraro becoming the first woman on a presidential ticket when she was the candidate for vice president in 1984. We have Anita Hill bringing issues of sex discrimination to the nation's consciousness to the forefront in 1991, when she accused then U.S. Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. We have, of course, Nancy Pelosi becoming the first woman Speaker of the House of Representatives for the first time in 2007. We have, of course, Hillary Clinton becoming the first woman presidential nominee just a few years ago in 2016. So what's happened? Why is the Equal Rights Amendment back in the news the last few years? I think you know the answer, and that, of course, relates to the election of Donald Trump a few years ago. People have become nervous watching the changing composition of the United States Supreme Court, that whatever gains were won are not permanent, that laws can be made and laws can be unmade by Congress, and rulings can be made by the United States Supreme Court, and then they can be overturned by a Supreme Court with different members on it. So the notion that whatever rights had been gained were vulnerable, that women could lose them, has led to a new focus on the Equal Rights Amendment. Also, people point out accurately that the United States Constitution today is actually the only major written constitution of any industrial democracy that lacks an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution. This is, of course, the Supreme Court today, with the additions now of Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch. So, a 5-4 clear conservative majority, with many people worrying about the possibility of losing Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm sure some of you saw this on Saturday Night Live. So as a result of that, there's been a new movement to try to reinvigorate the Equal Rights Amendment. And one of the things that's relevant to talking about that is, and I can only go into this very briefly, is also thinking about what does it mean to have a woman's vote, or is there a woman's vote? We talked about how in 1920 that Sheppard Towner Act was allowed to sunset because Congress realized that there really was no such thing as a woman's vote, that most women would vote based on other characteristics other than gender. After Donald Trump's election, people wondered, would that change? So here are just a few statistics to fill you in, and some of this I hope is familiar to many of you. The first is that prior to 1980, women voted in presidential elections in smaller numbers than men. But since 1980, women actually turn out at a higher rate than men. And on the left column, I show it by some racial and ethnic composition. But women are higher in all groups. But in terms of how they vote, these are the statistics. So 54% of women and 41% of men voted for Hillary Clinton. But when you break it out by race, you learn that the number of women who voted for Trump, of white women who voted for Trump, was actually higher than the number of white women who voted for Hillary Clinton, which just goes to substantiate once again that this notion of a woman's vote is really largely mythical. The Me Too movement, of course, has been sort of the successor to the Women's March, a movement against sexual harassment and sexual assault that has invigorated and energized many women, particularly many young women, but women of all ages. Many women elected to Congress in the last election, and here many of them are wearing suffrage white at a recent State of the Union address. And all these things have led new focus to be on the Equal Rights Amendment, the sense that there's new energy among many women, despite the statistics about the women's vote, the fear of a changing Supreme Court, the fear of Congress possibly rescinding the rights that women does have. And as a result, there's been new momentum for the Equal Rights Amendment. And if you've been following the news, you know that in the last several years, that 3 more states have actually ratified the Equal Rights Amendment: Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia very recently, just January of this year, last month. And so arguably, one might say, oh, the Equal Rights Amendment is now part of the Constitution. There were 35 ratifications, and now we are up to 38. But if you've been following it, you know it is not so simple. And the issue of where things are as we sit here today in February 2020 are very much up in the air. Because first of all, the time limit was imposed. And so the issue of whether or not that time limit was valid is something that will presumably probably be litigated in court. Some people say that Congress could not impose a time limit, that exceeds their authority under the Constitution, and so therefore these new ratifications are legitimate and valid and count. Needless to say, that is a position that has opposition as well. And then, of course, there were the rescissions I mentioned. How about those 5 states? So there are many people who want to fight for ratification based on where things are now. There are many others, including actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who alluded in a speech she gave just about a week or 2 ago at Georgetown University that she really thought it was best to start over. She was not tipping her hand and indicating how she would rule in a case before the United States Supreme Court, but I think she was giving her political advice, which is from her point of view, that if women want an Equal Rights Amendment, as we sit here in 2020, that the thing to do is to actually start over. Obviously, stay tuned since we have a major election coming up this year. So what I've done and I think I still have maybe 5 minutes for a couple of questions, is just give you, a very, very quick reminder, very quick overview of some of the kinds of issues that women have been thinking about, confronting, and dealing with in this century since women were enfranchised 100 years ago. And I'm happy to do my best to answer questions if you have them, or to hear your comments if you have those, since I'm sure some of you have been involved in these issues over the years. So do people have questions or comments? Yes? Yes. So what happened was when Virginia was poised to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in January. So people knew in November it was going to happen in January because the state legislature went Democratic in the election in the fall. They have elections in off years, so it was the election of 2019. So it was known that in January of 2020, once the matter was taken up by the Virginia state legislature, that they were going to vote to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Once an amendment is ratified, it actually getting entered into the Constitution is a ministerial act. In other words, it's reported to the National Archivist that 38 states, 3/4 of the states, has now ratified an amendment. Please, Madam or Mr. Archivist, add it to the United States Constitution. But the archivist, of course, is under the leadership of the executive branch, under the president. So before Virginia had a chance to ratify and send this request to the National Archivist, Donald Trump's Justice Department wrote an opinion ordering the archivist not to accept, not to record the Equal Rights Amendment. So it has not been recorded. So where it is now is in this funny sort of abeyance position, so that 38 states have ratified it, if you include the 5 that have arguably rescinded, but you have 38 at the moment. But it's never been adopted by the archivist. So it's sort of in this, no person's land at the moment, pending at least 2 different lawsuits. So a lawsuit was filed by the attorney generals of the 3 Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia attorney generals have filed a lawsuit asking a court to order the archivist to accept their ratifications and ratify the amendment. And then 3 states that have not ratified, including Alabama, Louisiana, and I forget what the third one is, but 3 anti-ERA states have filed a competing lawsuit arguing that any ratifications are null and void because any of these recent ones, because they came after 1972. So right now we have two lawsuits in 2 different federal courts in 2 different states in the country, one in Virginia, one in Alabama. Excellent question. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Has any other amendment had a time deadline?
There was at least one other amendment that did have a time deadline, and I actually think it might have been the Prohibition Amendment, but I have to double check. But there have been amendments that have been passed, very late in the game. So, for instance, it wasn't that many years ago that an amendment that was proposed almost 200 years ago that would bar Congress from raising salaries of members of Congress while they were in office. In other words, it'd have to apply to the next Congress, was ratified 200 years after it was proposed. But the issue of whether or not a deadline has meaning is something that's never been litigated by the Supreme Court. There were a couple of lower courts that have weighed in with various outcomes. So it's, stay tuned. Yes. You mean the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment? Well, I think, there are many different reasons, but honestly, the arguments that Phyllis Schlafly made in the 1970s remain the arguments. And the fundamental argument that's really been used most effectively currently is actually the abortion argument. The anti-ERA forces call the ERA the Everything Related to Abortion Act, and argue that the ERA is essentially, a way to mandate abortion into the Constitution. Pro-ERA forces will say that's not at all the case, that abortion was decided under different parts of the Constitution. Roe versus Wade did not relied on different existing provisions within the Constitution. But I think that marriage of the stop taking our privileges and the anti-abortion is the reason why there is still so much opposition to it. And if you were to Google, if you were to go home tonight and Google, anti-Equal Rights Amendment organizations, you will immediately come up with a long list of anti-abortion organizations. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes?
Why is the protection clause considered so weak? But where it says you not discriminate based on race, color, religion, and sex, why is that so weak?
You mean the Title VII, or I'm not sure what you mean? Do you mean the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? Well, the thing about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is it was passed for different purposes. I mean, it says that no person shall be denied equal protection of the laws. And the court has used what it calls strict scrutiny, which is this very high level of scrutiny to investigate any claims or any laws made that distinguish people based on race. But when it has come to gender, they've applied what's called an intermediate level of scrutiny, a much lesser level of scrutiny. And that has meant that some laws that allegedly discriminated against women based on gender have been upheld and others have been stricken down. So there's sort of a great uncertainty about where women's rights are within the Constitution. And in fact, Justice Scalia famously said that women's rights are not protected in the Constitution because the Equal Protection Clause has nothing to do with women. And that's not, at some level, that is not an unreasonable position. I mean, we have this whole body of jurisprudence where the Equal Protection Clause has been used and applied to women, but that's not to say that's how it has to be. So the Equal Protection Clause is considered a very uncertain basis on which to rest rights.
Because race is what it was intended, but never mind the religion or the sex.
Well, no, the Equal Protection Clause, religion and sex, that's Title VII. Title VII is legislation. That's employment legislation only, and that affects private employers. Those are the laws that make it so that if you work at companies that have more than 15 employees, or in Massachusetts, because there's a counterpart within the state, it's more than 7 employees, you cannot discriminate within your company, within hiring, firing, promotion, so forth, based on race, religion, sex, and so forth. But that's employment in the private sector, as opposed to laws that can be passed by governmental institutions. I mean, they're really, what's regulated by government and private employers are different. They're parallel but different. Do we have time for maybe one more question very quickly? Okay, final question or comment? Yes. We can do you also.
It says all persons born on that. It doesn't say all men.
The 14th Amendment. That's correct. That's why that's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her allies was so brilliant. They said it says all persons, but just because it says that, I mean, laws are all about interpretation. And so the U.S. Supreme Court has said, well, race is easy because if you have a white man and a black man and a certain job, there is nothing that distinguishes the ability of one to do what the other can do other than the color of their skin. When it comes to women who generally are often smaller, less physically strong, might get pregnant, have different needs, that this, pure equality, doesn't work. And in fact, the U.S. Supreme Court famously said in a case, I guess in the early 1970s, that pregnancy is not protected under the Equal Protection Clause because it doesn't affect women, only those who choose to become pregnant. So I mean, as long as you have those lines being drawn, the Equal Protection Clause just simply, in my opinion, doesn't really work.
So if I transgender to a man, I would have more rights.
Well, if somebody is born a man, yes. I mean, I don't want to make any comments about the law about people who change gender, since that is still something that's very much up in the air in terms of their full legal rights. But it's the issue is, as is often true in this country, what does it mean to be equal? Does it mean equality of opportunity? Does it mean equality to do the exact same task? In which case, you can see why race, but when there are different, women and men are not physically identical. And that's part of why you have the same issues with medical coverage and so forth. I mean, a vasectomy and an abortion are not the same procedure. They have things in common. They both have to do with reproduction, but they are different procedures and different biology. So it's very complicated. Did you have one final?
It's a very minor question, so I hesitate to ask, but the focus on using the word woman as opposed to women, you're talking about men and woman. And that, I know
Why am I doing that? Okay. I think it's become like a speech defect of mine because in the woman suffrage movement, you can call it the women's suffrage movement, and that is correct, and there is nothing wrong with saying the women's suffrage movement. But the participants in that movement called it the woman suffrage movement. They used the singular. That was how they chose to do it. In my book, that's why I called it Massachusetts and the woman suffrage movement. And I think I have become so accustomed over these last couple of years to always talking about women's suffrage that I probably tend to just do it in other contexts, whether or not I realize it. So why don't I stop, because I know we still have other plans for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
So we are very pleased to have with us this evening on our guest panelists here. We have Elizabeth Almeida, and Elizabeth is a member of the Westford Board of Selectmen since 2017. Before running for the board, she chaired the Westford Community Garden. While on the board, she has chaired the 63 Main Street Task Force, and in addition to serving on the Dog Park Task Force as a liaison to the Bruce Freeman Trail, and as a Northern Middlesex Council of the Governor's Counselor. We're also pleased to have with us Ellen Hardy. And Ellen was the first woman elected to the Board of Selectmen in 1972, serving until 1974. She was town moderator from 1993 to 2017, and she has served on way too many town committees and boards to list here. However, she is currently chairs the 35 Town Farm Road Task Force. And we are also blessed to have Beth Morrison. And Beth is the founder and chair of the Indefensible Westford Progressive Massachusetts. She has been a member of the Finance Committee since 2018, and she was a member of the fiscal year 2019 Classification Research Group appointed by the Board of Selectmen. And we are thrilled to have you all with us here this evening, and thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Barbara, and she's going to moderate our panel this evening. So thank you.
I'm going to see if we can shut this off. Yeah, if you can shut the projector off, that would be great. So we're going to open this up very quickly to all of you, but why don't we begin by asking, I'm sure, one of the... Oh, okay, I'll let you... Okay.
Unplug it.
You could, yes, unplugging would probably be an excellent way to go. It's so funny, often you can't get these things to go on. So why don't we begin what I think everybody would be very interested to knowing from each of you, what first led you to become politically involved or engaged? And in whatever order you like.
I'm being looked at. We'll go chronologically.
Yes.
I am Ellen Hardy, and I had the good fortune to move to Westford the same year that the League of Women Voters came to Westford, and that changed my life in terms of my involvement in town government. I think I had lived here for literally a matter of weeks in the spring of 1967 when I got a phone call from a woman telling me that Westford was thinking of starting a League of Women Voters, and would I be interested? I was 1 year out of college where I'd gotten a degree in political science, so obviously that spoke to me. The other truth was there were not a lot of organizations to meet other women in Westford in 1967. There was the Tadmuck Women's Club, but there was no newcomers and there was no junior women's club, so it was a great way and a great avenue to meet other women who might have interests that I had. And one of the first things that the League was required to do was a Know Your Town study. So we had to find out who the selectmen were and who the Board of Health was and who served on the school committee and what those groups did. And the other thing that we did was to create what was called an observer corps. The Westford League was not the first to have this. It was very statewide. And we were the eyes and the ears for the town. The Westford Eagle was 3 years away from being born, so we had no local newspaper. There was the Lowell Sun, but there was small coverage of the town of Westford in it. So by being League observers and taking notes of what was happening at these meetings, that hadn't happened before in the town of Westford. It was why some town board members called us the League of Women Vultures. It was a intense being under the microscope that they were not used to and many were not comfortable with. So in the process of this, and watching the 3-member Board of Selectmen with my newly minted degree in government, I thought, gosh, I think there are a couple of things that they need my help with. I'm still as naive as I was then. So in 1971, the town voted to expand the Board of Selectmen from 3 to 5 members. They wanted a little broader diversity. And so there were these 2 new seats on the Board of Selectmen. So 8 of us thought that that was a good idea. So 8 of us ran for selectmen in 1972. And I, to everyone's complete astonishment, won that election. It was 2 days before my 27th birthday. And there was immediately a recount. It just could not have happened that this 26-year-old woman who had blown into town only 5 years before had actually won the election. But the recount assured that I had. So the question that's, did I make this step because I wanted to make a point as a woman? And the answer is absolutely not. That really never entered my mind. And I'm reminded of a wonderful quote from Congresswoman Pat Schroeder when she ran for president, the same year I ran for selectman. And she said, when I've asked if I'm running as a woman, my answer is, what choice do I have? But that was simply coincidental. I really didn't give it any thought, and I'm wondering why that was. It may have been because I went to an all-girls school that was led by a very strong headmistress who was not a single spinster. She had married an attorney, raised 4 children, and then commuted to go back to Radcliffe to get her degree during the war, during World War II. And 5 years later, she was headmistress at Concord Academy. So she was a very strong example of, well, don't all women do that? I mean, I just thought everybody lived their lives the way that Elizabeth Blodgett Hall had lived hers. So for me to say, well, of course I'd run for student council, why not run for selectman? So that's how I started in government. My tenure on the Board of Selectmen was a disaster. And I don't know if it was because I was a young mother. Joshua and Christopher were 3 and 4 at the time that I ran. But the Board of Selectmen was not happy to have a young female on the board. They made that very clear. And it may have been the ideas I proposed and had nothing to do with my gender, but I definitely threatened them. I never got seconds to my motions. It was a very difficult time. And within 2 years, I resigned. I just knew it wasn't the place for me to be effective in time for someone to be able to run for my unexpired term. But what I did learn from that was that you don't need to be on the Board of Selectmen to be an effective woman in the town of Westford. This town is very amenable to wonderful creative ideas. The following year, I had the honor of being involved in turning the Rodenbush into a community center and have done 1 or 2 things since then. So I was not a woman's libber. I never burned my bra. I did not march on Washington. I just did the things that I did because I thought that they needed to be done. And I thought yesterday that perhaps one of the things, and one of the slides that Barbara showed, was of the younger people who were protesting the war in Vietnam and the times of the early 70s and the late 60s. And, all of those folk songs of Joan Baez and the Brothers Four and the Kingston Trio, those protest songs, those were the songs that I sang. My guitar and I. My guitar is named for the headmistress of Concord Academy. Her name is Betty. We're still together, my guitar and I. And I think that those words resonated with me more than I realized at the time. And I was thinking then about these comments tonight and the song that Phil Oakes wrote. It's called When I'm Gone. And there are many verses, and I'm not going to sing it, and I'm not going to even read them all. But there's one line where he says, "I won't be asked to do my share while I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here." And that's how I got involved in town government.
I personally would prefer to listen to Ellen's stories all night. I just love hearing the history of women that have gone before me in this town, and knowing, that the trail was blazed by many women before I had the chance to join the select board. And I wanted to start this evening by thanking Linda and Barbara and the Historic Society for gathering everyone tonight. I'm delighted with how many people are here and interested in this topic, and I sincerely wish I had been here at 7 o'clock instead of at a budget meeting. Truly.
I skipped it. So.
I noticed you skipped it. I was a little envious that I hadn't done that as well.
I gave them prior notice. I would not be there.
So my involvement in town government started about 7 years ago. The Agricultural Commission had not met in 7 years, and the town manager was tasked with convening the Agricultural Commission, and she gets her goals in the sometime late summer, and she has until June to finish them. And she finally got the committee to even hold a meeting in May. And in the spirit of open meeting law, I invited a bunch of my friends to attend, and this committee thought it was just going to be, 3 or 4 or 5 of them getting together to satisfy the town manager, and I had about 9 friends that joined me. I think one of them was laughing back there. And so we surprised them, filled the room, and managed to get them to vote in new members, and then I volunteered to chair the committee. And that was, I think, around May 20th, and the town manager informed us that the Agricultural Commission was on the agenda to present at the town strategic planning retreat at Kimball's 3 weeks later. So we, after we spent 5 minutes thinking, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to pull this together? We realized it was the perfect opportunity to ask the community what we should make our priority and what we should make our first projects. We brainstormed a dozen ideas, had a little dot voting activity, and the number one priority for the community was to start a community garden. So we, I was still very, very brand new to how town government works, so that was in June. I think in August I met with Chris Clutchman, who is the director of land use, and told her our idea, and she said, well, the budget's almost done for next year. There's no way you can get a garden started. You're going to have to find a department to sponsor it and fund it, and the budget's tight. And so we're looking at a few years, and I left the meeting thinking, how hard can it be to put a seed in the ground? But then Chris said, but there is one other option for funding if this is going to be a town project. She said, Community Preservation Committee reviews their proposals in January. And she said this might count as open space and or recreation. So she said there might still be a window of time here to get funding for the community garden for the next season. And sure enough, we put together a proposal. We started with about 3/4 of an acre, and we went to CPC and got funding for the fence and a shed, and set up a sort of a temporary water situation with the water department to see if this garden was really going to work. And 2 years later, we expanded the garden from 3/4 of an acre with 100 plots to 1 3/4 acres with 250 plots. And we always have a wait list for the garden. So, and it's such a beautiful place of community for anyone who's been down there. And actually, it's just a beautiful place. The town's current rec director, Jim Duane, when he came to town, I told him that we were part of the rec department because his employees would come over and till the garden for us. And he came, he met me at the garden one day, and he said, I have to tell you, Elizabeth, I don't have a good impression of community gardens. He said, but Westford's community garden is the most beautiful, well-kept community garden I have ever seen. And I think our gardeners and the whole community take great pride in having such a beautiful community garden. I love it, not just for the gardening part, which I think a lot of people enjoy, but also for the community aspect. And we have about close to 200 families involved at the garden. So to see that many Westford residents enjoying this piece of property that the town owns and coming together and really building community. And one of my favorite stories from the garden is that 5 years ago when we started, I was down there, my daughter who's back there, she was 3 at the time, even cuter than she is now. And I know it's impossible to believe, but she was. And we met our friend Doreen, who was about 75 at the time, and we got to know her over the summer. And at the end of the summer, Doreen said, could I spend more time with your daughter? so she started coming over on Friday nights for dinner, and then we adopted her as a grandma. And I just think that's the beauty of what you can do, in a community garden, but also in the wider community. As Ellen said, the town's very amenable to creative ideas that bring people together. So I served on the Ag Commission for several years, grew the community garden, and then the honest truth is that the night Trump was elected, I cried and wondered if my daughter would have the same rights I've had and the same opportunities, and if her life would, if we were going backwards. Like, I really couldn't imagine leaving this country in a worse situation for girls. And so after I mulled on it for 2 days, I thought, well, if the answer is more women in the pipeline, what excuse do I have not to put myself in the pipeline? And I thought about it for another week or two, and then I said something to my husband, fully expecting him to say, don't take on that stress, and he just said, well, of course. And so that started my my campaign for the select board, and I learned a lot. I've met a whole lot of good people through the election process, and really meeting the people who have made Westford what it is today was really inspiring. And to know that we're trying to continue that legacy of making Westford not just a place where, with good schools, where it's a great place to have a family, but also to preserve the open space, and that we collectively share that value as a community, and we're willing to put our money there, was something that I really admired. And I hope that I could continue, take my turn carrying on that legacy and doing that work for the town. And I would just wrap up my opening comments by saying, relevant to tonight, we no longer call ourselves the Board of Selectmen. We voted at the town meeting in the fall to be the select board. We're still waiting for the final paper to come back from the state before the town manager will start putting that on all the agendas, but most of us have taken to just calling ourselves the select board. And at town meeting on March 28th, we'll be asking the community to make the vote on the bylaws, the general bylaws and zoning bylaws, to change all of the language in the bylaws as well. So Westford's joining about 90% of the other towns, I think, in the Commonwealth that have already made that change. So please do come on March 28th and support that item as well.
I'm the newest to town, so we moved here in 2013. And before that, I grew up in central Illinois. And I know you're a Midwestern girl too. And you said you were born in central. So, we got a lot of Midwest here. And I don't think politics was really a big thing whenever I was growing up. We were evangelical Christians. So a lot of what you talked about with, I heard a lot of that growing up about abortion. And I chose to become a social worker, so I went to college and grad school, and I think that that's where I started to kind of put together the impact that social policy can have on people's lives. And I was actually looking it up, and Alice Paul was a social worker. Yes. So there was a lot of social workers involved in the suffrage movement, and in the progressive era. Was kind of the beginning of social work as a profession. And it's changed a lot through the years, but it still has a very strong component of advocacy for people who are underserved and underrepresented in our society. So I think that was kind of the impetus for me to get more active in politics. So when we moved to Massachusetts, I stayed home. I had been working as a family therapist, and then I decided to stay home with my children because childcare is very expensive, and all my salary would have been going to care for my children. So I thought, well, I might as well just care for them myself. So, but I wanted to still stay involved in the profession, so I joined the National Association of Social Workers Political Action Committee, and that's the committee in Massachusetts that endorses candidates at the state level. So I really got to know a lot about endorsement process and how the state house works, and what kind of qualities I liked in a candidate. And so that was kind of my first experience with Massachusetts politics. And then I had to take a step back when I had 2 children, and it was just too overwhelming to take 2 kids to meetings. So, and then we moved to Westford, further away from Boston. So it's harder to get to the city and be involved in those committees. So then, similar to Elizabeth, Donald Trump was elected, and I cried with my children as well. They went to bed thinking the election had gone one direction, and I had to tell them it went another direction, and we cried together in the morning. And I decided, like, I can't just sit at home and do nothing. So I posted, I think, on Facebook, does anyone want to start a group with me? And some of you were at my first meeting. So we started meeting, I think, in January of 2017, and we've been meeting ever since, and we've done a lot of different things in town. And our next thing is we're going to have a Medicare-for-all Forum on March 31st at First Parish Church across the Common. So love to see you all there. And so, yeah, we've done a lot of different things, and then Elizabeth started recommending me for things. She said, there's a committee about the split tax rate. I think, I was like, I don't know anything about a split tax rate, but I think she's like, I think you'd be a good representation for a certain. I said, okay. So thank you for the push. And so I served on that committee, and then that kind of got me into the finance committee mindset, and so I decided to go that direction. And so this is my second budget cycle with the finance committee, so I feel like I'm still learning how things work, but I've learned a lot about just how everything works together to actually impact, how policy impacts people's lives at the local level, and so it's been really great. So it's been a nice journey, and I don't know what I'll be doing in the future, but Westford's been a wonderful place to kind of cultivate my experience. So,
Well, there's no. Well, to have women like you in the positions that you are in, Westford is lucky indeed. That is so clear. Thank you. I think what I'll do is ask couple of short follow-ups, and then we'll open it up. Turning first back to Ellen, you've obviously been involved in almost 50 years of seeing political life. I would love to have you share, you've seen some very optimistic times and some rather depressing times. What's your overall assessment of the long journey as you see it? Because one of the things that I think about a lot, and one of the things I talk to young audiences about a lot when I speak about suffrage, is the importance of trying not to always think about 2 years and 4 years, that sometimes you have to, it's great if you can have victory in 2 years or 4 years, but sometimes the political climate is such that you have to be able to keep the long perspective, and understand that you just have to persist and persist and persist. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts as you reflect.
I think I've been somewhat spoiled, Barbara, because Westford has been such a open community to new ideas. So we haven't had to work quite as hard as perhaps some other towns have in terms of reticence. I just noticed on the handout that was put together for your talk 2 weeks ago that of elected boards in town at the moment, 55% are women. So that sure wasn't true 40. I guess I just calculated it was 48 years ago this week that I was elected to the Board of Selectmen. So I'm a very instantaneous gratification kind of a soul. So thinking long-term has never been my long suit. But I do think that the concept that you get a vision and you get a group of people who share that vision with you. They didn't know that when they first met you, but then they know very soon thereafter that you all do the same vision. And it really is a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. That the goal is over there in the distance, but when you are working on it together, just day by day by day. And so I think when I look back to think that it's really been half a century, it's just boggling to my mind. But that's how it's all been done, is that it has been take project at a time, get like-minded people who will work with you on that project and never take no for an answer, then that can be accomplished. But as I have humbly admitted, I have not been the woman who marched on Washington, and I have not, joined in I've been blessed to be a large fish in a very small pond. People often encourage me to run for the state legislature or even beyond. And I had no interest in that at all, because I really need to see what's the biblical term, the outward invisible signs of the inward invisible grace. So I need that quantifiable part. But I do think that the hope and the belief that, and it is, so much of what I've done has been supported in working with women. Eventually some men in Westford accepted me, eventually. But I've never seen it as the long haul. I've always seen it as one project at a time. So perhaps I'm not the best person to talk about.
No, but
vision.
that's a very important perspective. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to answer that similar question, or that would be great. Or I'm sure that you must speak often to groups of children, including your daughter and friends and so forth. What do you do? How do you inspire young girls to follow you into politics, into public life? I mean, what are the lessons that you like to leave your audiences with?
Well, if I could start with my favorite story from my daughter lately, of what I hope to inspire in young girls. She knows what I'm going to say. A few months ago, I was walking home from school with her, and she was talking about how when she grows up, she wants to be a mother. And so I said, okay, that's good. And I said, and do you want to do other things? Because most of us are a mother and, many other things. And she said, in charge. So, which I just love. I love 8-year-old girls thinking they can grow up to be in charge of whatever it is, whether it's, chairing the town select board and running those meetings, whether it's being in charge of the entire town meeting and, trying to keep hundreds of people online, or, as I remind my daughter, she can be in charge of, laundry right now. So just to have that perspective that they can grow up to be in charge of something, I think is really important. And one of the exercises I've done with groups of scouts that I've spoken to is we first talk about everything that the town government does. What are taxes? Why do we pay them? Who pays them? How much? And what do we get for that tax money? And we start going through a list of services and who mows the park that you play soccer in and who's going to respond if you call 911. So we go through all of that and get it in their mind of just the breadth of services that we receive for our tax dollar. And then one of my favorite exercises to do with them is we do a little simulation where we have 3 kids be on the select board, and we have one person be the Parks and Rec director. And then I have the rest of the students take sides on a simulation of, should we have a carry-in, carry-out policy at the parks? Because they can relate to the trash left at the soccer field after the games on Saturday mornings. And then I have them formulate their arguments, and I'm the moderator, and I call on the kids, and they have learned already, usually by 8 or 9 or 10, how to create a persuasive argument. So they get up and start making the persuasive argument. And I have the select board representatives, their job is to write questions, so they have to ask people questions when they come up to the mic. And I love that exercise because it makes government real to the kids, that this is something they can do. This is the type of decision they can be a part of as they grow up. And then they also think about it when they go to the parks and they see trash lying around, and then it becomes real to them that somebody's going to have to pick that up, and we're going to have to pay somebody to pick that up. So I love taking the town government. We don't get into debt exclusion and all that stuff with them, but I try to find ways to get them to relate to their town government, so they start asking questions, so they get curious about it, and hopefully start to see themselves where they could have a role in the government. And even in our little simulation, if they think, well, I want to be the the Parks and Rec director that's going to be in charge there. I want to be the person. I had one boy once that absolutely was ready to run for selectman at age 10. Just had that, curiosity and confidence. So I just love giving them the experience of what it's like to be in charge, and hopefully inspire them to continue to do that in all stages of their life.
Well, we've heard two fabulous and really quite happy answers. Beth, a question for you, but of course you can, one of the first things you learn when you're on a panel, of course, is you answer the question you want to be asked, not necessarily the question that you are asked. So you can answer whatever question you like. The question I'm going to ask you is that in your particular line of work, you are probably confronting quite a number of people who are feeling something like despair on a pretty regular basis. And what advice do you have for them, particularly for young people who feel that they're growing up in very difficult times, and sometimes it's hard to kind of feel optimistic and feel like things are going to be okay? Any advice? But as I said, if you don't like that question, just answer a different one.
That's a good social worker question. I feel that way myself often, and it's definitely, it's definitely it's hard to keep hopeful. So we talk a lot about self-care, and try to incorporate that into our group, and our, giving people permission to kind of be active when they can, and it's okay to step back when you can't, when it's too much, because it is overwhelming, all that's happening, and it's happening so quickly, and there's so much coming at once. And so I've been trying to focus on things that are actionable, like at the state level. So one thing that we did is we collected signatures for paid medical family leave, which was one of the big items that you talked about in your presentation too, was family leave. And because we have the Family Leave Act, but it's not paid. So we collected a ton of signatures around Westford and Chelmsford, and it was kind of a way of feeling like you're having an impact. Mm-hmm. And we did have success with that, and the legislature did pass a pretty good. It wasn't everything we asked for, but it was a pretty good paid medical family leave act. So in Massachusetts. So it's good to do those kinds of things where you can see your impact. And we've also, one of the things our group does is write postcards, which is also very popular in the group, because it's something people can do at their own time. And then it's kind of nice to see those elections, and sometimes they win, sometimes they don't, but to feel like you're having an impact. So I've been trying to channel when I feel despair, or when those around me are feeling despair, to kind of try to channel that into like, what can we do about it, instead of just, watching the news or complaining about everything, but try to have some action that people can do to feel like you're making an impact.
Why don't we open it up to any of you to ask questions to either the whole group or to any particular one, and we'll make sure that everybody gets equal opportunity to speak. Yes?
I just really wanted to say that I met Beth because they were having a cookout. Somebody said, oh, gee, you should go meet this group. So we were feeling tremendous despair over the term, because I was already for Hillary and my wife, And when we went and met Beth and the group that later became Westford Indivisible, we were so taken with the fact that they were young folks, because when you're 70, everyone's young, And these young folks were interested and were really trying to do something. So we started going to her group, and let me just say this about this lady. She's a wonderful leader. And the postcarding, we did postcarding today, we did postcarding on Tuesday, 2 different groups. But what that group does is it brings people together that are feeling impotent and like, what can we do? But it brings us together and puts us in a more positive place where we feel the support of each other. And and when somebody wins, we feel like we did it. It was like But I think that's what you have to do. You have to try to be with like-minded people to keep you going, because it's so discouraging day after day. But I did want to say, we live in North Chelmsford. We don't even come to Westford, but we attend Beth's groups and all the things that she puts together for going to the State House. And God bless you for the work you're doing.
Yes.
I was struck by Ellen's role model.
Can everybody hear?
No.
Are you able? I can repeat it, but are you able to stand up and maybe say it more louder?
I was struck by Ellen's saying that she had a strong role model who inspired her. And so I was wondering if you could say what year you graduated college, perhaps, and then if you had a strong role model. And also if you had learned anything about women's history in your educational experience.
The answer to the second one is absolutely zip.
Could everybody hear the
Never
question?
took a class.
Okay.
So, yeah, so the question was, did I have a role model and what year I graduated from college, and did I do any women's studies at all? And the answer is the role model was of my high school, and I graduated from high school in 1962 and graduated from college in 66. And even though I majored in political science, there were no courses. I did have the advantage of going to 4 colleges in 4 years, so I sampled quite a curriculum. That was not because I was expelled on several occasions. My husband and I married after my freshman year at Northwestern, and he was in the Air Force. So I went to whatever college was closest to whatever Air Force base Mike was stationed at, and that left to an eclectic education, and graduated from BU. But at none of those 4 colleges was there anything that even resembled a women's studies class. Up through 1966. I think 70 probably was about the turning point, but perhaps those were started. As I mentioned, my role model truly was Elizabeth Blodgett Hall, the woman who was the headmistress at Concord. I hadn't realized how much she did. I didn't realize how extraordinarily unique what she did was. I just thought, well, you know, all women do that, have 4 children, and then take the bus into Cambridge and get their degree at Radcliffe, and then come back and teach history at a private school and become headmistress in 4 years and stay there for 25 years as an outstanding woman. Oh, and then leave and start another school called Simon's Rock, which she founded after she left Concord Academy. So that was the kind of, that really was why I think I thought that things like turning an empty school into a community center or having a recycling program in a town that didn't have one, of course it could be done. This is what Elizabeth Hall would have done. So I was very lucky in that regard. So I think that she was and also the other people who were at that school. If I had gone to a co-ed high school, I don't know if I would have thought, well, of course it's women who run for those offices, who we're all women, who else is there? So I never even thought about the context of we and they, him and her. It was just, that needed to be done. I'm the person who can do it, and oh, by the way, I do happen to be a female, but probably Elizabeth Hall was a large part of that. But I never even heard about women's studies, until mid-70s, and by then my academic education was far behind me. The rest of my education was still very much ahead of me. Did you take women's studies?
I did not. Like Beth, I grew up in a conservative Catholic Midwestern family and culture. I graduated from college in 2001. The idea of feminist studies or any of that was so far beyond the culture I grew up in that, at college I didn't entertain any thoughts of that. I would say the biggest feminist influences on me have been during and after college. I worked with 4 different Catholic orders of priests and nuns. And the Catholic nuns I've worked with have had the biggest influence on my thinking about gender and women's equality. And the last order I worked with, they were the Sisters of St. Joseph in Cleveland, and they had turned their mother house, their 100-and-some-year-old mother house, into a wellness center. And when I started working there, I think in 2004, they had already been doing yoga and Tai Chi and all of that for 20 years. And these nuns, you would look at them and they'd be, 80 years old, and you would think of them just as, quiet little sister, Teresa, who sits at the reception desk eating her little 2 tablespoons of soup for lunch. And then as you got to know her, you realized that she was the principal at a school in inner city Cleveland in the 60s during the race riots. And they were educating children, figuring out how to educate these children in that environment. And then you start unpacking the stories of these women, and they had very little regard for the priest in the diocese there, because what the priests were doing. Meanwhile, the sisters were the ones, even at 80 years old, doing the work. And the ones, got to know sisters who, even at 80, were going out under the bridges to find people who needed help. And they were running a women's shelter where they were going out in the streets to find women and figure out what they need and try to bring them into the shelter. And then they were using art therapy to help these women process things that they'd experienced and hopefully, help them move to a more stable situation. But it really was the women that, being with them and working with them every day. And we worked in the mother house. We ate lunch with all of the retired nuns, and we would get to hear their stories over lunch. And just to be inspired that, how they had lived their lives for 50 or 60 years, the work that they had humbly done, was really inspiring to consider, when I was in my early 20s, to think about what I would want to do with my life.
So I graduated college in 2002 and grad school in 2004, and I studied social work, so that it was a lot of strong women, and learning about people like Frances Perkins, who was in FDR's administration, one of the authors of Social Security Administration. She was amazing. She was a social worker. Learning about Jane Addams. People like that were definitely present in my education, because that's what the profession of social work began as, was these strong women who took very pertinent things that were happening in society and made them reality, and made social programs around those problems that they saw. So probably growing up, my biggest mentor was my mom, even though our politics are kind of different, because she's very religious, and not that I'm not religious, but she's conservative religious. So we disagree sometimes on a lot of things, but she was always, she's the reason I became a social worker. She was, always helping people and, inviting people to come live with us. And we had foster kids whenever I was growing up. And she was always trying to help someone and trying to do something to make the world a better place. She started her own nonprofit. She tried to open a homeless shelter and got shot down by our town authorities, who did not want a homeless shelter in their town. And so I saw her being a leader in her own way. And I think that really inspired me to become a social worker and to be a leader in my own way. And then professionally, I worked with a lot of strong women who led organizations and were great people who were, doing like the nuns and doing the work behind the scenes and organizing people and managing people and, doing all that hard work behind the scenes and making things happen. Probably one of my biggest mentors right now would be Ayanna Pressley. And she's just such an inspiration to me. And the way that she, got elected and the way that she's representing her district it's just amazing.
Just one quick comment on the area of women's studies. It's something I think about a lot, and I'm actually teaching a course right now at Tufts University in the Women's Studies program on the women's suffrage movement. I mean, women's studies was and is a wonderful, wonderful invention, and it was about 50 years ago at many schools. But of course, there's really no reason why somebody should have to take a separate course to learn about the history of women. I mean, we will have really succeeded when every regular history course fully encapsulates the experiences of men and women and minorities, and then for additional information, you could take subsequent courses. But the notion that the way you learn about women, even in U.S. history, is by taking a separate course on women in American history. So I would say we still have a very, very long way to go, despite the fact that I appreciate all those programs.
Yeah.
Additional questions, comments? I know I've seen some other hands. Yes.
Elizabeth, first of all, I want to thank you for your contributions and how, and it was sad to see that you chose not to take out papers again to be on the board. Where do you have your sights set? I know I probably shouldn't ask this question.
Oh, you can ask where I have my.
Are you going to be putting your energies? I have a lot going on already, but.
Yeah, I mean, the first place where I'm going to put my energy is my children because they're 8 and 10, and I joke that when I ran 3 years ago, it felt like motherhood was never going to end. You've probably all been there. And then 3 years later, you realize, wow, this is going really fast, and this is going to be over before I know it. And the truth is, I didn't go on any bike rides with my kids last summer. And I'm like, I don't want to give that up. So, you know, I may come back to this. I may do something else. I won't be able to help myself. So I'm telling myself to take, you know, some time off. You know, I definitely need to scale back some of my commitments right now. Just, you know, I have too much going on. But when we got together to plan this, it was really a delightful conversation, you know, hearing what each of us were thinking about saying. And one of the notes I made was that, you know, hearing Ellen's stories of, she has a story of one of her boys getting out of the house one night and coming over to the Board of Selectmen meeting and coming in.
We live next door to the town hall. So Joshua was 3, and he walked into the selectmen's meeting and asked me to tuck him in. I thought it was enchanting. My colleagues did not.
So when I heard that, I felt like, you know, there are some things that change. I would say on the board that I'm serving on is absolutely, you know, incredibly respectful board. The men and the women, you know, we all work together very well. I would venture to say I've run a meeting better than some of the men on the board, and I could probably also read a spreadsheet better than some of the men on the board. But even though, you know, some things have changed and I feel very welcome on the board, I feel like some things have not changed, and that being, you know, when you have young kids and just what you are giving up in terms of wanting to be there to tuck them in bed and to be available, that part hasn't changed. And so I think that's still, you know, something for women to consider. And I see this with Lori Trahan too. You know, her daughter goes to the same school as my children, and I just, you know, Monday night I'll be there for the science fair and watching my kids do their science fair exhibit, and Lori will probably be in DC because she flies down on Monday and comes back on Friday. Oh, my husband, I mean, that's...
I mean, would he quit his job to go spend extra time?
Oh, I mean, the reason that I can do stuff like this is because he... Yeah, and actually I asked my kids one night whose supper they like better, you know, because I do most of the cooking. But when I have select board meetings, you know, and stuff like that, like, you know, my husband makes dinner those nights and puts them to bed and all that stuff. That's not a problem. But the kids inform me they like Papa's cooking better. And I said, what do you mean? Like, Papa has like 2 recipes, and and my son said, because he makes fancy food. And I said, what do you mean by fancy food? Because he takes saltine crackers and puts the canned sardine with a little drop of hot sauce.
That's fancy.
And so I thought, what have I been doing? Like trying to cook balanced meals when I could, like, I feel like we need to swap here, and I need to get credit for the fancy food for serving sardines for supper.
And my husband was home that night in 1974 when Joshua walked next door. He just didn't notice he'd left.
Yeah, so I mean, I really do most of the volunteering in the community in my marriage, and I work as well. And we both work, but then I have done more, you know, evening volunteer commitments. And my husband, you know, it's not uncommon right now for me to be out doing, you know, something 2 or 3 nights a week, and he will take care of, you know, all the home stuff those nights. And, you know, I'll come home and the dishes will be done and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I have a very supportive spouse. It's just me personally. It's not my spouse telling me that I should be home to tuck the kids in bed. It's me realizing that my son, who's almost 11 and still wants to be tucked in bed, I am guessing I have weeks or months left of that. And so I want to be sure to enjoy all that. And I know I can come back to this. You know, there's nothing saying in 5 or 10 years that I can't run again or find another way to be involved in the community and to volunteer in something that isn't quite so demanding at this phase of my life.
But one thing I do appreciate about what you've done, your contributions, is you've pulled other people into the process, which I think has been, awesome. You pulled me in, and I know other people have been pulled in, and so you're kind of widening, who's interested now in running instead of the same people.
I will say there's one other thing I've been working on in terms of where I'm going to put my energy. I do think women continue to need support when they're serving in these roles, and I kind of threw myself in, not knowing much about what I was getting into. And fortunately, I've had people I can talk to. I can call Ellen and know that she's probably experienced something similar. I've had lunch with Ron Johnson, and knowing that he sat in the seats and had to make difficult decisions and had angry neighbors or something. But I think for all the effort that organizations have made to get more women on the ballot and to get more women elected, I think the next step of that work is to make sure women have mentors and support. And so I've been mulling over this idea for quite a while and recently connected with 2 women on the select board in Sudbury. And so I said, we need to get other locally elected women together. And, if this really is the pipeline, we need to have relationships so that if seats open up at the state level, we already have those relationships with women in other towns and we can support each other to move up if we choose. And so the 2 women from Sudbury, we picked a date in January and we started just putting it out by word of mouth to locally elected women in the Metro West. And we ended up with 24 women on a Sunday afternoon when we met at our fire station. And it turns out a couple towns, they're looking at fire stations. So the women were excited. They were excited to learn, to see what we had done, to figure out the budget, who was our architect, what features did we put in, so they were excited to see that. And then we sat in a circle and it was just what I had hoped it would be, which was part sharing, personally, people's story, and part sharing, what projects folks are working on. And the first success, I would say, out of that circle came 48 hours later, because one of the gals from Sudbury said they were getting ready to vote to put on the town meeting warrant the purchase of their section of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. And that rail trail will eventually, hopefully, connect Lowell to Framingham. But we need Sudbury to build their chunk, and they have to buy their land, and some of their board members have resisted this. And so I said to one of the women, would you like me to write a letter? Should we get the other communities along the rail trail to all lobby the rest of your board? And she said, well, sure. So I sent a letter the next day and said, I'm the chair of the Westford Select Board, our liaison to the rail trail, and the mother who enjoys the trail with her kids. Sent my letter, and then when I watched their meeting, one of the men said to this woman, Janie, he said, did you tell her to write that letter? It sounds like it's just a mom who uses the rail trail. And then the other guy on their board said, he said to this woman, Janie, he said, why were you talking to her? You shouldn't be talking to people without our permission. So I said to Janie, I said, is this really what you have to deal with every other week? Because I realized how spoiled I am to be on a respectful board with men who respect the women. But just that situation for a woman to volunteer to go every other week and to be treated like that. I only watched 10 minutes of their meeting, and their meeting was 3 hours, and she said, yes, the whole thing is like that. And I just think women need support if they're going to stay in this role, because who wants to put themselves through that for 3 hours every other week? And so that's the driving force behind my plan to gather locally elected women to provide that support network and just hopefully keep more women in their offices.
That sounds, what a wonderful effort. I think we probably have time for one final question because I don't want to, yes.
Jane Maxson, quick question, well maybe it's not a quick one. Since you had just mentioned about that the situation with the men, how important do you think it is for us women to have men as our advocates as well?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a mutual, it has to be mutual. And I think what I strive to model is not that women should be the leaders, but that there should be a respectful relationship between the men and women. There should be no difference between a woman chairing a meeting and a man chairing a meeting, or whether, no gender roles in all the roles of town government. There's no reason for to be a gender divide.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I would agree.
Mm-hmm.
all of us in this advocacy for ourselves, are we advocating, are we getting men to support? Because the question that you would ask about your husband and Ellen, your husband, I'm married to that kind of husband, and there's no delineation between his and her and what you do. But I think it's so important that we do find men that are coming along in this journey with us. Example of going to women's conferences and they have all women there
Right.
with no men to have the conversation.
Right.
And so I'm hearing the women, and I think we have to be careful of making sure that in those conversations we're drawing men that support it as well. Because as we've learned from your talk last week, a couple weeks ago, the men, we need that men to support that. So
Yeah, I was just going to respond to that. Yes, I mean, the suffrage movement, when the woman didn't have the vote, they knew that the only way they could succeed was for men to vote to share power. So they really are historically fantastic models of how to build alliances because they had absolutely no choice and showed that it can be done. Although, of course, the fact that it took 80 years makes one have to sort of pause and think about that. But yes, building alliances, is always critical. I know we need to wrap up, but do you want to respond, any of you, to that, or any concluding comments?
Yeah, absolutely right.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara.